Hello folks, welcome back to another serious study of God's Word. I'm Nunnally, and today we're going to be starting a series on the major events of Jesus' life leading up to His death, burial, and resurrection. Today we're going to be looking at Jesus' journey from Galilee to Jerusalem that would then set up the events that led to His death. We're going to do this by primarily focusing on the Gospel of Matthew as he gives us the coordinates of Jesus' movement from Galilee to Jerusalem. And so we're primarily looking at the Gospel of Matthew. Let's read beginning in chapter 19. It came about when Jesus finished these words, his teaching ministry in Galilee, that he departed from Galilee and came into the region of Judea beyond the Jordan. Now, let's just look at Luke for a moment because he gives us a much more specific itinerary. In Luke 17, it says, he was on the way to Jerusalem, and this is the last trip of Jesus out of many that he has taken to Jerusalem. It starts when he's 12 years old, back in the Gospel of Luke, when he goes to celebrate the festival of Passover with his mother and father. But this is at the end of Jesus' life, in his last trip, and it says that he was passing between Samaria and Galilee. Now, higher critical scholars are going to say, this makes no sense. And Luke, obviously a non-Jew and not from the land of Israel, doesn't understand the geography of the land. There's Galilee and then there's Samaria, and there's no in-between. However, if you'll look with me at this satellite map, which has been layer tinted intentionally to show the valleys in green and then the mountains in brown as well as yellow, Upper Galilee, very high in elevation. What Jesus is doing, here's Nazareth, and what Jesus is doing is he is passing between, here's the border between Galilee and Samaria, and Luke says he's passing between Galilee and Samaria. That would refer to what is called the Herod Valley or the Beit Shan Valley. That doesn't belong to Galilee and Herod Antipas, nor does it belong to the Samaritans as a part of Samaria, but is rather a part of the fiefdom of the Decapolis city of Scythopolis. So Josephus and Luke are very specific about this particular part of land, portion of land, and they are right on the money and speaking in concert with one another that Jesus is leaving Galilee through the Herod or Beit Shan Valley and headed toward this larger valley that contains the lower Jordan River as it exits the southern end of the Sea of Galilee. So Jesus is now moving through the lower part or the lower Jordan Valley as he moves toward Judea and will eventually take a right at Jericho and will move up the Jerusalem-Jericho road, you know, the one that Jesus tells the parable in Luke chapter 10 about the man who went down from Jerusalem to Jericho and fell among thieves who beat him, stripped him, left him for dead, and the Good Samaritan comes along and takes him the rest of the journey going to Jericho and drops him off at an inn in the city of Jericho. So Jesus is going to take the Jordan River route. Now, some people are going to say, well, that's the way that all Jews traveled when moving from Galilee to Judea. They did not want to go through the middle of Samaria because of three reasons. They feared some sort of reprisal against them by the Samaritans, or they were concerned about ritual purity in traveling through Samaria. Those sorts of concerns would cause them to skirt Samaria, go the Jordan River route, and then come out at Jerusalem. The problem with that is the New Testament places Jesus in Samaria on a pretty regular basis, and his disciples, his followers after him. Josephus also tells us that it was the custom of Jews to travel through Samaria, passing between Judea and Galilee. It was the norm. You will also get the rabbis who tell us that they owned property, they raised produce, they tithed that to the temple. You were allowed to leave your animal in the hands of a Samaritan. You could eat food that was prepared by Samaritans, and the rabbis decreed, quote, all pathways in Samaria are to be considered ritually pure. So Jesus typically traveled straight south from Galilee to Jerusalem, passing through the very heart of Samaria, which I've outlined in this yellow line here. Why then, the question is, why does he depart from that make sense itinerary, cuts off half of the travel time, half the expense, half of the wear and tear on your body to go through Samaria instead of traveling through the Jordan River route? Why does in this last journey, and it's really clear, Matthew and Luke we've read, are placing him moving down the lower Jordan Valley in the direction of Jericho before he cuts up through the Judean wilderness and finally arrives at the Mount of Olives and then Jerusalem. Why is he doing this? Why is he departing from the Jewish norm, and why is he departing from his own already established means of travel between Galilee and Jerusalem? That's the question that is on the table, and I hope to be able to help move us in the direction of an answer as we continue to study. Let's continue in the Gospel of Matthew and follow Jesus' itinerary. As they were going out from Jericho, so it's really clear that he starts somewhere in the Jezreel Valley, moves through the Herod Beit Shan Valley, turns right and goes down the lower Jordan Valley until he gets to Jericho. As he's leaving Jericho and now going to move up in altitude toward the city of Jerusalem, then he's going out from Jericho, and this is the event where he encounters blind men. The other Gospels will tell us that one of them, the name of one of them is Bartimaeus. Bartimaeus, we say, but Bar is son of, like bar mitzvah. Bartimaeus, and the son of Timaeus, and Jesus heals him and this friend of his of blindness. So that's how this event takes place. Jesus goes out of his way to go through Jericho, not his normal travel route, going to Jerusalem. And he is leaving Jericho now to head west to Jerusalem. It says, then when they approached Jerusalem and had come to Bethphage, to the Mount of Olives, so now he's come through the Judean wilderness and he is at the Mount of Olives just east of the city of Jerusalem and about to enter the city. Now, all of this presumes, this whole reconstruction, what Jesus normally did in traveling from Galilee to Jerusalem, that presumes an article that I wrote back in 2016. I can't believe that it's been almost 10 years since this article appeared in print. But the question was, did Jews travel through Samaria in the time of Jesus? And in this article, it's available for free on the internet, you'll see me process through the New Testament, Josephus, and the rabbis, and I will be bringing that degree of evidence to answer this question. In all three corpuses of literature, New Testament, Josephus, rabbis, they all say the same thing. It was normal and common. It was expected that Jews travel through the heart of Samaria to get from Galilee to Jerusalem. So again, that raises this question. If this was such the norm and Jesus had already established this as his own personal practice, we see this in the Gospels, then why is it that he chose in this last trip to Jerusalem to go the Jordan River route instead of the shorter, easier, quicker route straight through Samaria? Here's the map again, and just as a real quick review, this is Jesus' normal route from Lower Galilee. Here's where he lived on the Nazareth Ridge, and here's the Beit Shan Valley or the Herod Valley. Normally, Jesus would have cut directly through the heart of Samaria and ended up at this little letter I, the city of Jerusalem. Why then does he intentionally divert from that established pattern of travel and go instead between Samaria and Galilee, as Luke says, and as Matthew picks up, goes down the Jordan River route until he comes to Jericho. And then from Jericho, going from east to west through the Judean wilderness to Jerusalem. Well, we have this passage in the Gospel of Matthew. And when he had entered Jerusalem, all the city was stirred, and then he enters the temple. That begins Passion Week proper here, when Jesus cleanses the temple a la Matthew chapter 21. So here we have the temple as Jesus would have seen it from the top of the Mount of Olives. This is obviously a model. It's at the Israel Museum. We use it regularly in working with groups as we're teaching on site, and we use this model to reconstruct some of the events of Jesus' life. This is the Jerusalem of Jesus' day, as Jesus would have known it. So from the Mount of Olives, you have the Kidron Valley separating Jerusalem from the mountain that's on the east, which is the Mount of Olives, a ridge, from the Temple Mount, which is the first thing that you come to when you get to the city of Jerusalem. Here's the Eastern Gate, or what most evangelicals call the Golden Gate, and then you have the Court of the Gentiles, and then the temple proper, with the highest building being the Holy of being built, constructed over the Holy of Holies. So this is the Jerusalem that Jesus would have seen. I'm going to suggest to you that the reason that Jesus took this unusual approach to Jerusalem, taking the longer, the more difficult, the more dangerous, because of thieves in the Judean wilderness, the more dangerous route going down the Jordan River, instead of his normal practice of cutting through the heart of Samaria as a prophetic sign. He is signifying, he's announcing something by a prophetic action. Now you say, well, what is a prophetic sign action? Well, for example, the 10 plagues that were performed by Moses. He talks about the Nile River. The book of Exodus talks about the Nile River turning to blood. It talks about the cattle dying and that kind of thing. All of that is leading up to the final plague, the death of the firstborn, and the ultimate release of the Israelite prisoners, slaves from Egypt, and allowing them to embark on what we call the Exodus, the wilderness travels that eventually take them to the land of Israel. But Moses is just the fountainhead of these prophetic acts, stretching out the staff and that sort of thing. Because we see prophetic actions taking place all over. For example, the prophet Isaiah. He is naming one of his children Maher-Shalal-Hashbaz, which is probably the longest name in the Bible and maybe the longest name that you'll ever encounter in your life. But it basically means the spoil speeds and the prey hastes. Why does he name his child this unusual and incredibly long name? Because Isaiah is predicting the destruction of the southern kingdom and the exile of the rest of the Jewish population, Israelite population, into Babylon in what is called the Babylonian captivity. So the spoil speeds and the prey hastes, that's simply saying destruction's coming and exile is going to follow, and you're going to eventually find yourself in Babylon for 70 years. Another child is born to Isaiah, and he uses his name as another prophetic sign action. He names the kid She'ar-Yashuv, which is the mirror opposite of Maher-Shalal-Hashbaz. In his first son, he's talking about the destruction is coming. In this She'ar-Yashuv, it's a Hebrew way of saying a remnant will return. And so he's not just predicting judgment, he's predicting restoration from judgment. These are, by the naming of his two children, prophetic sign acts. Jeremiah will be told by God to go and bury a waistband up in near the Euphrates River. We get this in chapter 13 of Jeremiah's prophecy. And then he's told to go and retrieve that waistband, and it's rotted, and that's what's going to happen to God's people. It's again a prediction of exile and of destruction of the people. Ezekiel has more sign acts than any other prophet, He has at least 12, and I've mentioned a couple here. One is that God tells him to take a sword and to shave his hair off and his beard off, and then to do certain things with that hair. Part of it he's supposed to burn. Part of it he's supposed to throw to the wind. Part of it he's supposed to, some kind of way, bind to the edge of his garment. And that's symbolic of a remnant. All of the people are going to experience judgment and destruction, that kind of thing. But there's a small amount of the hair bound to the waistband that identifies the Israelite, the ancient Israelite, as a covenant member, belonging to God, responsible for obeying the commands and reflecting the nature of God to their world. And so these hairs that are put in the edge of the garment are indicative of there's going to be a small purified remnant that God is going to bring back and restore to the land, and He's going to renew His covenant and that kind of thing. Another one of Ezekiel's sign acts is when he's told by God, lie on your side for a period of time and set up a brick and kind of enact the destruction of Jerusalem after a period of siege, and then total destruction and eventual exile. And this is a sign act. Another example that we get is from Jesus, because yes, Jesus is one of the people in the long line of Hebrew prophets. And so Jesus calls fishermen. That's a sign act, because why would a carpenter call fishermen to be his disciples? But he intentionally walks along the Sea of Galilee and he finds people who are engaged in the fishing industry, and Peter and Andrew and then James and John, and he calls these to be his first disciples. Why would a carpenter choose fishermen? Well, let's look at Jesus' Bible. Jesus' Bible tells us in Jeremiah chapter 16 that God is going to send fishermen, and they will fish for these lost people of the nation of Israel, and He's going to gather them back together, and He's going to restore them. He's going to reconstitute them as a people for His name, a remnant again, a remnant of the whole. And when Jesus goes around preaching, teaching, visiting various cities and villages, and He comes with people who look like fishermen and talk like fishermen and dress like fishermen and probably are smelling like fishermen, before anybody even opens their mouth, before Jesus says the first word, people are already going, wow, here's a rabbinic figure, a person with rabbinic authority, and yet He's traveling around with disciples who are very clearly fishermen. These people know the Bible, and they know that there's only one place that connects with this kind of behavior, and that is Jeremiah 16:16. I'm going to send fishermen, and they're going to fish for you, and they're going to gather you from the north, south, east, and west, and they're going to bring you back together and reconstitute you as God's people, and God's presence is going to be there, and He's going to renew His covenant and restore His blessing and that kind of thing. And basically, this is a prophetic sign act. The days of restoration, the days of the dawning of the Messianic era are here. And Jesus is doing this as a prophetic sign act that simply is announcing, without saying even a word, at least in the culture that He's a part of, that everybody would have picked up on. Everybody would have gotten this. Another example of Jesus using a prophetic sign act is when He curses the fig tree. It has absolutely nothing to do with Jesus hating trees or Jesus being hacked off because He doesn't find a fig to eat on the tree. It's not the season for figs. And so what we're seeing with Jesus is that He is acting in a way that reflects another prophetic text, Jeremiah chapter 8. And there it talks about the fig tree and the no fruit and it withering. So you've got these three major components, and you have to ask yourself the question, if Jesus is acting in a way that would then hearken the people observing this behavior back to a specific prophetic text, Jeremiah chapter 8, then what is it that He's what is He digging at? You got to go back to Jeremiah 8 and read the whole thing. And it basically is saying that because the people of Israel have been fruitless, and God has taken care of them and provided everything they need to be optimally fruitful, then because you've been fruitless, because you've not borne the fruit you're supposed to bear, then what's going to happen is you're going to be judged. You're going to be destroyed. It's a prediction of destruction. And that indeed does happen approximately 40 years after Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection. In AD 70, the temple, the city would be destroyed, the people would be dispersed, and the like. So we've got the fig tree. His temple cleansings are also an indication, a prophetic act. There's something that needs purification going on here. There's a problem here with the Temple Mount. And all of the rabbis, well, at least a couple before and after Jesus, are recognizing there's a major problem on the Temple Mount. Later rabbinic literature, it's the leadership has carried us off the rails here. The chief priests, the high priests, the priestly leadership has taken the temple in a direction that God never intended. And for Jesus, he says, and he's quoting the book of Jeremiah again, you've turned this place into a den of thieves, Jeremiah chapter 7. So Jesus is doing this sign act business all over the place. Don't be surprised then if maybe some of his journeys end up being sign act. A final example that I wanted to share with you, because it takes us on into the period of the New Testament church, and there's a prophet whose name is Agabus. And in Acts chapter 21, he comes down from Jerusalem to where Paul is staying, and he takes Paul's waistband off of him, kind of like a belt, and he ties his own hands and feet together, and he says, this is what the Lord says. The owner of this waistband, when he goes to Jerusalem, is going to be bound in exactly this kind of way. That is another prophetic sign act. So now take all of that, this whole discussion about prophetic sign acts, Jesus included. He's doing this just like the other prophets of the Hebrew Bible and even into the New Testament church. And let's factor that back into Jesus' choice, intentional choice, to go the Jordan River route, the longer and more expensive and more difficult and even more dangerous route, instead of going the normal route through the Samaritan hill country. I want to introduce a couple of passages to you from another prophet from the Hebrew Bible, one who is involved in prophetic sign acts, and that's the prophet Ezekiel. In Ezekiel chapter 11, Ezekiel is brought from Babylon to the land of Israel in order for God to show him certain things, almost basically prophetic visions into the future, to show him what is about to happen. And so he's brought from Babylon, where he's already in captivity, back to the city of Jerusalem before it's destroyed. And what Ezekiel sees is astounding. You know, the book of Deuteronomy says that God is going to cause his name to dwell in a certain place. And the way that shakes out eventually is that's the city of Jerusalem, and specifically the Temple Mount and the Holy of Holies. So this is the mountain of the house. This is the house of the Lord. This is the place that God has chosen for his special dwelling presence to manifest itself. And what Ezekiel sees basically blows him away. He sees, and Ezekiel's a priest, served in the temple. He is into the temple. And it says in Ezekiel 11 that he saw the glory of the Lord. The glory of the Lord in the book of Ezekiel, you can go back and look even at chapter 1, the chariots and the lightning, etc. This is a manifestation of God's presence. So when you're reading Ezekiel and you're reading about the glory of the Lord, understand that that's just Ezekielian terminology for the presence of God. And the presence of Yahweh went up from the midst of the city and stood over on the mountain east of the city. Now, what is that mountain? That mountain's the Mount of Olives. Ezekiel doesn't name it by name, but he's describing it. The mountain that's east of the city is beyond the Temple Mount, over the Kidron Valley, and on the Mount of Olives. It's basically Jesus' itinerary when he's approaching Jerusalem backward. And the reason is Ezekiel is saying God's presence, he's withdrawn his presence. And that means withdrawn his protection and all of his covenant blessings and what have you from the city just prior to its destruction. For what reason? To demonstrate I am displeased with what's going on here and there's judgment to follow. So God's glory, his presence, has removed from the city of Jerusalem. And then at the end of Ezekiel, it's only 48 chapters. In chapter 43, Ezekiel starts to see that the judgment has now passed and that this period of purification and refinement of a faithful remnant, that's happened. That's now in the rearview mirror, and now it's time for restoration to begin. And this last part of the book of Ezekiel is all about, it's not all doom and gloom. At the end, it's all restoration and glory and renewed presence of God and a renewed covenant, a renewed people of God. And Ezekiel sees this in chapter 43. And behold, the glory of the God of Israel. Remember, glory, code word in Ezekiel for the presence of God. The presence of the God of Israel was coming back. He's restoring his presence. From which direction, though? Ezekiel says specifically, from the east. He left and went toward the east, his presence did, and now his presence is being restored, coming back from the same direction to which it left in chapter 11. The coming from the east, and the earth shone with his glory. I fell on my face, and the glory of the Lord came from the east. We're saying going over the mountain east of Jerusalem, which is the Mount of Olives, crossed the Kidron Valley, and now depositing itself, resting again in the very place from which he left. And came the glory of the Lord, verse 3, verse 4, came into the house, but the house, that's code for temple. Like I was glad when they said unto me, let us go into the house of the Lord. Or in 2 Samuel 7 where Nathan the prophet says, yes, your son is going to build a house for the Lord. House is just code for temple. Came into the temple by the way of the gate facing toward the east. We call that the Golden Gate or the Eastern Gate. And the Spirit lifted me up, brought me into the inner court, and behold, the glory of the Lord filled the whole house. That's exactly what we get in the book of Exodus and Numbers when we get the glory cloud coming upon the tabernacle and the glory cloud coming upon the temple when Solomon builds the temple in Jerusalem and dedicates it to the worship of the one true God. This is exactly what Ezekiel is reflecting here. God's glory is going to be not partially, but fully restored in the same way that we got with tabernacle and Solomon's temple. And so it's then that Jesus comes into that temple. He has come back from the east. Jesus has come from the east, not from the north, as you would get if Jesus came straight through the heart of Samaria. But Jesus intentionally approaches Jerusalem from the east, over the Mount of Olives, through the Kidron Valley, and into Jerusalem, coming from the east to the first thing that he does is go to the temple. That basically is following the same itinerary that Ezekiel has shown that God's glory will be restored. And so when Jesus gets to Jerusalem, when he arrives in the holy city, he is that physical manifestation of what Ezekiel calls the glory of the Lord, the presence of the Lord. And as Ezekiel says, so also happens in Jesus' itinerary. He comes to Jerusalem and doesn't just, like go to a friend's personal home or his favorite place where he liked to hang out. He goes immediately to the temple, and that's following Ezekiel's itinerary for the restoration of the glory of the Lord coming from the east and resting upon the house, the temple. And that's when you have this first major event that marks the final week of Jesus' life, what we call Passion Week, and that is the cleansing of the temple. So I hope that what you have gotten from this is a better understanding of not just Jesus' itinerary. That's a minor player in this discussion, but it is getting into the mind of Jesus and understanding how Jesus is functioning in His world, and on the basis of all kinds of precedent, like all of this prophetic sign act material that we discussed. And I hope that it helps you to better appreciate the person of Jesus. This is sheer genius, what Jesus is doing here, and entirely intentional. He's doing it on behalf of the audience that's watching. His disciples, other hangers-on, people that are seeing Him come into Jerusalem. Remember the triumphal entry? It's a big deal, and the whole city knows about it, including people who are there for the festival of Passover from outside the land of Israel, from outside the city of Jerusalem. This is a big deal, and Jesus is demonstrating His incredible ability to work in Scripture, to function as one of these great Hebrew prophets, and to communicate this incredible truth that the presence of God is literally here, and it's in the person of Jesus of Nazareth. God bless you with this study. I trust that it'll help you to walk closer to Him and love Him more and appreciate His glory even more. And I trust that this will be the case in subsequent studies that we do as we ramp up to a greater appreciation of Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection. God bless you this season, and walk with Him and find somebody to serve and love them in His name.